Good morning, everybody. It's just after 11 o'clock, so I think we should make a start. More will join us, I'm sure, as we get underway. The event is being live streamed, so if you don't want to appear in the live stream, particularly when we get to Q&A, you need to select Stop Video now. During the event, we recommend that your best viewing experience is clicking on the speaker view in terms of Zoom if you haven't used Zoom before, and the hashtag for the event is COVID cities. So just let me give you a sense as to how it's going to run. In a minute, you're going to hear from three of my colleagues about the work that we've been doing on how the pandemic is impacting economies of cities and towns across the UK. After they've made their three presentations, which should take around 25 minutes, we'll then open it up for question and answers. If you have a question, you don't have to wait until you've heard the presentations. You can post your questions as we're going along. Submit it via the chat function on Zoom and send it as a private message to ask a question. So you can do that during the presentations. You don't have to wait until the end, but we'll have a look at them and then we'll crack on. So that's where we'll kind of get to, and we'll look to finish at no later than 12 o'clock. So that's how the event will run. Let's move quickly on to the presentations. The first presenter is my colleague Kathrin Enenkel, who's a senior analyst at the Centre for Cities. She's going to give us an overview of the work she's been doing, looking at the impact of the lockdown on jobs and how this differs across cities and towns. Kathrin, over to you.
Morning, everybody. So in my most recent piece, I looked at what the COVID-19 crisis means for the economies of British cities and large towns. And I was looking at which sectors are most likely to be affected or maybe even benefit in the short to medium term, and where they are located to get a sense of the likely immediate impact, geographic impact across the UK. In the first step, I grouped industries into 4 categories according to their expected probability to furlough or to lay off workers, based on the available information that exists, such as assessments of industry experts, share price developments, or government guidelines. So you see at the very left, the industries I categorized as with a lower chance to lay off workers, whereas like at the very right, it's getting a higher chance to get laid off workers. So on the one hand, we have sectors expected to be less exposed to the crisis, meaning that jobs in these sectors are just facing a low probability to be affected. The one in the very left, the health, public administration, or those which are facing a particularly high demand, such as food retail, delivery services, or pharmaceutical products. Then we have the category affected, where you can see it's food production, high-skilled business services. It's like industries which may face a reduced economic activity, but also a reluctance to immediately lay off workers, because there is either a basic demand for goods and services and a will to keep an often highly skilled or specialized workforce. And in this category, we would also find a lot of jobs which can be performed at home. As I said, the knowledge-intensive business services. And if there's like the reaction on like problems and demands would be rather pay cuts, so people would have a higher probability to actually stay in the labor force. Category 3, the vulnerable, are expected to face a sharp fall in demand and or difficulties to operate, such as non-essential retail, most manufacturing industries, a lot of local services, but are likely to recover at a certain point, as there is the expectation that consumers buy at a later stage. Retail may partly switch to online shopping, and jobs in this category are however more vulnerable than in the other categories, and it's expected that there's a larger use of the job retention scheme. And then we have the industries in the category 4 at the very right. Those are expected to face immediate negative effects, but also a kind of long-term damage and a very slow recovery for specific industries. And there's an expected high probability that initially furloughed people actually will turn into layoffs. We can see it for leisure activities, aviation industries, etc. When we see all these groupings of industries, it does not mean that all the jobs in one specific industry are automatically very safe or very unsafe. This is why we talk of vulnerability of certain industries. The figure here shows our cities, our 62 cities and largest town in Great Britain, ranked by their estimated vulnerability of their economy to the direct economic impact of COVID-19, given their industrial structure. So the dark and light green bars at the left, they are the share of jobs in unaffected or slightly affected industries I mentioned before, while the purple bars at the right show the share of jobs in vulnerable and very vulnerable industries. We can see that every city has at least 1 in 5 jobs classified as either vulnerable or very vulnerable. That's mostly because of the impact of the government's lockdown restrictions on local services, retailers, restaurants, shoe repair shops. These businesses can be found across cities. That means every city has a stock of affected jobs. Jobs in these local services businesses make up 2/3 of all jobs estimated to be vulnerable or very vulnerable. When we look at the geographic spread of the vulnerable and very vulnerable jobs, share of jobs, as indicated with the purple categories previously, we can see that there's not really a particular geography to the most or least affected cities. When we look at the location of the cities which have the highest shares of people employed in vulnerable and very vulnerable cities, so cities with the lowest shares of jobs and particularly exposed industries are Oxford, Bradford, and Worthing. Oxford is expected to only have like 23% of its workforce employed in this very vulnerable or vulnerable industries. And this is due to a high percentage of jobs in knowledge-intensive services, the educational sector, which may be affected in the future, but not right now. Worthing has a high share of people working in health and related social care industries. But when we look at the cities with the highest shares of jobs in exposed industries, these are Crawley, Luton, and Derby. In addition to the affected jobs in the local service industries I've mentioned, they have also larger shares of jobs in exporting industries, which are affected. These are mainly in the aviation industry. When we look at Luton, Crawley, they have like a lot of jobs in airport-related industries, whereas like Derby has actually a lot of aviation manufacturing, which is also expected to be affected because aviation, as we can see, has really been affected very badly. So I was also looking or giving some guesses what can happen after the lockdown and the crisis is ending. One aspect to look at it in order to give a guess on how quickly cities are likely to bounce back after the lockdown has been lifted would be to have a look at how much the exporting base of a place has been affected. We have seen that actually a large share of vulnerable industries are local services, which are tied to a local market, such as retail repair shops, driving schools, etc. But also some exporting industries are classified as vulnerable and very vulnerable. There's those that serve a regional, national, or international market. And these are actually the industries which bring the money into the local economy and create a demand for the local services once the lockdown is lifted. So if the exporting base of a city is relatively unaffected, it would mean that more people are in regular well-paid jobs and create a demand for local services once they start operating again. So those places should be expected to bounce back quicker if we look at this. So the vertical axis in this on this figure is showing the level of exposure. We know from the previous slides, these are the purple bars, while the horizontal axis shows the affected jobs in the exporting industry as a share of all exporting jobs of the city. And the higher the value, the more difficult we expect a place is likely to recover. And we can also see Crawley, Luton, and Derby. They're very much at the right, meaning that their exporting industries are very much affected, according to our research, which makes it also more difficult for the local services to recover. So what does it mean for policy? For sure, we're just in the beginning of looking at the policy effect. But when we see at the different industrial structure, we definitely must follow a place-based approach. At the one hand, for sure, there should be a further support of local services in every part of the UK, because in every part of the UK, local services are affected. But on the other hand, there must also be a sectoral approach for particularly affected exporting industries. And focusing on certain industries. Yeah, and if there are industries or danger that some industries may shrink a lot in the future, that actually jobs won't be able to restore, there must also be much more support and investment in further education and helping people to switch industries and to apply new skills. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Kathrin. So I think in a sense that the structure of the economy matters according to the evidence, but it's not just thinking about the industries or the sectors per se. That's one angle, I think. But very clearly from Kathrin's analysis, you have to think very carefully and focus on the nature of the jobs or activities that take place in a certain place within those industries. I think that really matters as well. So a combination of industry and your industrial structure, but actually where you then sit in relation to the jobs that are done. And we know that different jobs, even within one industry, are distributed across space in different cities or large towns. So let's move on to our second presentation. So our second presentation is going to come from my colleague, Elena Magrini, and she's going to focus on which cities and towns are best able to cope with the current situation and the lockdown, particularly focusing on some recent work we've done around debt, household debt. So Elena, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. So alongside the fact that jobs are affected by the coronavirus pandemic, there are at least two other components that affect the ability of people to have an income and to get by during this crisis and earn an income in the longer term. So what I'm going to talk about first is in the shorter term, looking at household finance and what that can tell us about the ability of different people in different places to cope with the crisis. Obviously, we know that given a certain drop in income level, having savings or having debt can make a big difference in the ability of people to cope. And in particular, having a higher level of debt not only can add the stress to already stressful situation, but can put people in a much harder financial situation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about work that we have done with Kanishka Narayan on the geography of debt across the country. The first thing to notice when talking about consumer debt is that the level of unsecured lending per adult vary quite considerably across the country. I'm talking about unsecured lending, so that's all the lendings but excluding mortgages. And when we look at it, we see that Warrington is the place with the highest level of unsecured lending per adult, and that's almost twice as high as the level of unsecured lending in Oxford and Cambridge. They are the two cities with the lowest level of unsecured lending per adult across Great Britain. Now, this per se is quite interesting, but it doesn't tell us much about the ability of different people to cope with the crisis. You might have a very high level of unsecured lending, but also a very high income, which means that at the end of the day, your ability to repay this debt is much better than if you had a high level of lending, but a low level of income. And actually what happened is that when we plot unsecured lending against income, we see that if on the left-hand side, we have our unsecured lending picture with no clear geography to it, when we instead plot it against the income that different people earn on the right-hand side, what we actually start seeing is a clear north-south divide, with cities in the North and Midlands and in Wales having a much higher level of debt relative to their income than people on average in cities in the Greater Southeast. And more specifically, when we actually look at the number, Warrington is still the city with the highest level of debt to income ratio of 21%, and it is followed by a bunch of other northern and Welsh cities. So Swansea, Sunderland also have a high level of debt to income. And just to visualize it, what that ratio actually means is that for every £5 a person earns on average in Warrington, they actually owe £1. And that is quite big if compared to what actually happens to the average person in Exeter or in Cambridge or in Oxford, where again, for the £5 they earn, they actually only owe 35p. So it's quite a big difference. And the other thing we looked at is not just this debt to income ratio, which obviously will be quite affected by a reduction in income for related to coronavirus. The other thing we looked at is at problem debt. So across all the debt that people have, problem debt is defined as the debt that people struggle to repay. And what we see is that not only some places have higher level of debt to income ratios, but in these places, the level of problem debt is also higher. So not only the debt plays a bigger part compared to their income, but they struggle to repay it. And so this I'm talking about places like Liverpool, Hull, Middlesbrough. They are in a much more vulnerable financial situation when we think about the possible opportunity of having a reduction in income. And actually, this is what's happening during coronavirus pandemic. So if we go back to what I was saying just earlier about what this actually all means in practical terms, if we consider two cities, Sunderland, one of the cities with the highest debt to income ratios, and Exeter, one of the cities with the lowest debt to income ratio, what we see is that while they start from these different positions, their positions are even exacerbated even more during the pandemic if we expect a reduction in income. So if we look at a best case scenario, assuming that the average person is furloughed and not made redundant and only see a 20% reduction in their income because they're put on the government job retention scheme that pays 80% of their wage, what we see is that even this just small hypothetical 20% reduction in income has a much bigger effect on the average person in Sunderland than the average person in Exeter. And the debt to income ratio in Sunderland becomes 26%, so a quarter compared to 20% before. And this, I'm going to stress this again, is quite important because I'm looking at a best case scenario in which people are furloughed. But if you imagine people, and we know that millions of people have signed up for universal credits, these people are going to see a massive fall in their income, and so their debt to income ratio will become even higher. And while a lot of companies have granted debt holidays in the short term, that will play a role in the longer term while we try to resume activity and bounce back after the crisis. Interestingly, what we can also do is to look at how the industry exposure that Kathrin has talked about and the debt exposure that I just talked about overlay across the country and what overlap across the country. And what we can see is that there are a lot of places in which not only there are a lot of jobs at risk, but that also where people have high levels of debt to income, respect to their income and high level of problem debt. In particular, we see that Blackpool, Sunderland and Hull are the three cities set to be more exposed to the risk of coronavirus. And that of these 15 cities, is also worth pointing out that Luton and Peterborough are the two only cities in this list that are in the greater southeast of England, whereas all the other cities that are most exposed to coronavirus are in the north of England, in the Midlands and in Wales. And now, this is really important because if we think about the word pre-pandemic, pre-coronavirus, the government was really keen on its leveling up agenda and reducing inequalities across the country. But actually what we see on this list is that all the places the government was trying to level up are actually the places more exposed to the risk of coronavirus. And it is reassuring to see the health secretary saying that leveling up will still be priority in terms of the economic response after the crisis. But this also shows that we need urgent action to do that. On top of that, coronavirus will not only have an impact in the short term, it will also affect the income opportunities of people in the longer term. And one way to look at it is to think about the younger generation, especially the people in schools right now who are seeing schools closures. Why am I looking at that? Well, there is extensive literature from the US and from Canada looking at the impact of summer breaks on children's learning. And what we know from the literature is that during the summer break, children are likely to experience a learning loss. So they forget part of the material they learn during their academic year. And this learning loss tends to be bigger for children from disadvantaged backgrounds because they have fewer learning opportunities. Now, coronavirus is, and the schools closures it creates are a long summer break for children, so basically, in terms of this learning loss. So when we think about these children from disadvantaged backgrounds all across the country, what we see is that with the exception of Luton and London, the cities with the higher share of disadvantaged children are all in the north of England and in the Midlands. So at the end of the day, this means that the learning opportunities of children in some parts of the country will be affected more in the longer term by coronavirus. And these parts of the country are the same ones that we just mentioned in terms of industry exposures and problem debt. So what does this mean for policies? Well, first of all, COVID-19 is likely to exacerbate existing inequalities between places. And that requires urgent actions from the government to try to minimize the effects of the crisis on regional inequality. One way to do this in the short term is to make sure that there are the payments of the benefit schemes. The government has put in place a very generous benefit scheme, but now we need to ensure that these payments get to the people that need support in a timely manner. And also what we need in the short term is that, while, as I said before, right now people are benefiting from debt holidays, actually people are also supported to manage their debt so that they can have a plan to repay it as we go through this period. And lastly, obviously the impact on children, especially children from disadvantaged backgrounds, will be felt quite strongly in the longer term. And so while the government has already provided broadband support and laptops for children from disadvantaged background, we need to assure that further support and investment is given to them to bounce back from this crisis. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Elena, reminding us in a sense that the ability to cope with the lockdown is obviously massively influenced by the relative position going into the lockdown, and that holds at the individual as well as at the place level. And a worry, in a sense, we have a worry, others have had similar worries, that the lockdown and what comes next reinforces, if not worsens, the existing differences between places and people, both in the short term and in the longer term as well. So a kind of interesting sort of reflection on that, and then the obvious connections to the levelling up debate and agenda as well, which we heard a lot about before the pandemic, and we're beginning to hear a little bit of that now from various members of the government. So remember, you can post your questions now. You don't have to wait until the end. We'll curate them and call on you to ask them. So that I think, just don't wait until we've heard from our last presenter, which is my colleague, Paul Swinney, Director of Policy and Research at the Centre. Paul's going to talk a little bit about how, around our thinking about how the pandemic may or actually may not affect how we work and where we work in the future. So Paul, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. Now, no doubt the majority of people on this call are currently working from home and dealing with the delights of the technologies that we're using in order to do that. And there's been a lot of discussion over recent weeks from different commentators, ranging from commentators in the newspapers through to David Attenborough, suggesting that now we should all work from home because we've tried the technologies and actually they work and it's not so bad, and that's the way forward. But there are 3 points I'd like to make that just offer a little bit of caution around that, which is quite important in terms of our thinking for sort of economic development, supporting certain parts of the country. And I certainly don't think that it's necessarily the end of the city. And also think we need to be quite careful about suggestions we've heard about, well, we can level up the economy now by just allowing people to move out of London and go and work in the Pennines or work in the Lake District because the technology allows access to that. So let's say 3 points. First point on that is that not every job can be done from home. Now, that might seem like quite an obvious point, but it does feel like it's something that does get lost in the debate. So again, no doubt, everybody who's on the call now, works in a type of job where it's a case of pick up your iPad or your laptop, find an internet connection, you can in principle do your job anywhere. But clearly that's not the case for things like people who work in retail, restaurants, cafes, those sorts of jobs. And indeed, I think the predictions you've had about the fall in GDP in the next quarter from the OBR of a fall of 35% suggests that actually quite a large part of the economy can't be done from home, and actually only part of it is continuing on. We can see that even in terms of the types of jobs or number of jobs that are done from home. So before the crisis, somewhere between 5 and 12% of jobs were done from home across our cities. We've looked at some estimates about how many jobs you think could be done at home. In Doncaster, it's around about 20%. That increases to 40% in London. But we're still talking about 3/5 of London's economy that can't be done from home, and 4/5 of Doncaster's economy that can't be, because of the nature of the jobs that they have. Point number 2 is, how effective are the jobs that can be done at home? How effectively can you do them at home relative to being in the office? Now, I think what's the enduring benefit of a city is the ability to have face-to-face interaction with colleagues. And no doubt when, the last couple of weeks when we've been dealing with technologies, we've all had frustrating moments where we haven't just been in the same room as each other to share information ad hoc, or it's quite difficult to read people's body language. The technologies we have are really, really good, but they're still not as good as face-to-face interaction. And so we'd expect that to continue to be important in the future. Now, if we look at the data on this to try and help guide us with it, I think what we see is that those jobs that are most easily done from home are actually those jobs that are most sensitive to location. So these types of jobs over the last 20 and 30 years have been disproportionately based within cities, and city centres in particular. So if you think about the jobs that Kathrin was talking before about these exporting industries, if you look at the high skilled element of those, so banking, law, software, app development, those sorts of jobs, around about 25% of all those jobs in England and Wales were based just simply within city centres in 2011. Now, city centres account for 0.1% of land, but 25% of these jobs, which suggests that companies were weighing up the balance and saying, well, we know it's quite expensive to be based within city centres, but actually the benefit of face-to-face interaction is such that they're still preferring to be based within that city centre rather than being based elsewhere. And I wouldn't expect the crisis to see a huge shift in that. Now, some people, of course, may decide to work at home, say, on a Monday or on a Friday, but still spend a number of days in the office because of the benefits of having this face-to-face interaction. But the third point I want to make is the challenge that this then poses for cities, particularly those that have got a lot of jobs in their centres. So those places like, say, London and increasingly Manchester and Birmingham, where public transport plays a very large role in terms of getting people into work every day. If we're continuing to see large funneling of people into a small place in the centre, what does that mean in terms of how we get them there? Certainly the London Underground in particular, which brings in 80% of all central London, London's transport network brings in 80% of all workers into the centre of London. There's quite a challenge there in terms of capacity. So what are we going to do around that if the tube carriages can't get as many people on as what they usually do? If Metrolink in Manchester can't get as many people on the carriages that they usually do, what does that then mean for cities in the short term in terms of walking and in terms of cycling especially? I think that's something that we will need to give a lot of thought to, both from a policy perspective and within local government as well, national policy and local policy, about how we try and overcome that challenge and make sure that our cities continue to get firing again when this crisis passes. Certainly it's the case that things will be different in the future as to how they've been in the past. We don't think, from what the data suggests, that there will be wholesale changes. Thanks very much. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Paul. Very good. So that concludes the three presentations. We're beginning to get our questions coming in, so I'm going to turn to them in a second. Shall we get that out of the way? So bearing in mind, just keep continuing to send your questions in to ask a question, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. We'll take one at a time, because I think taking more than one can be quite difficult in the technology. I'm going to say who it is. Be ready to unmute your mic. Say who you are, where you're from, ask your question, and then if you don't particularly feel it to one individual, I will do that. And so our first question comes from Ben Gardner. So Ben, get ready to unmute your mic and post your question, which is a question both to Elena and Kathrin, I think, around this issue about sectors, tasks, jobs, how they occupations, how they vary across space, and have we factored that into some of our thinking? So Ben Gardner, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, I mean it's really about the sector versus the occupation or function issue, as you said. We can kind of explore sectoral differences ad nauseum, and it gets us a certain way. But we know that places, cities, towns across the UK, Great Britain, wherever, have become a lot more similar in terms of their sectoral structure, to the point where it tells us less and less about how places perform. And what differentiates them more is the functions that the sectors within places actually fulfill. And that is the best proxied, as we know, by occupational structures, because you can't exactly measure what people do in terms of their functions. So the question really is, given that, what can we know from occupational structures, and does this give us a different picture in terms of how cities might be impacted or might be more vulnerable, as opposed to just a purely sectoral structure?
Excellent, very good. Thank you very much indeed, Ben. Kathrin, why don't you start us off with that question about that Ben's just put to us, and then I'll ask Elena for a thought as well. So Kathrin, over to you.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, you're totally right. That looking at the occupational structure is definitely an important thing. We know that probably particularly the low-skilled occupations are in danger to be affected. I decided for this industrial approach because I have seen similar analysis for other countries, and I also wanted to know whether there are like similar patterns. And I also think it gives like as a good first view on how like some places are more or less dependent on certain industries. In the next step, maybe an occupational view or look at makes sense for us, but we also must always look that the data are available for our cities we are looking at. And I think sometimes bringing the industrial and the occupational structures together is causing some troubles.
Okay, very good. Elena, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Kathrin, and I think she just gave a very comprehensive answer. One thing I would add to that is that while when you look at occupation, you might be, for example, better able to identify who is able to work from home and who's not, so you can make the distinction between the managerial roles and the other roles. The thing is that different sectors are affected by different ways. So the same manager might be able to work from home in the food industry sectors and in some manufacturing sectors, but if the manufacturing is shut down because the supply chain is shut down, that means that even if both of them potentially could be working from home, the effect is very different by sectors. So I think the industrial approach, the industry approach, first of all, was kind of very relevant to this.
Okay, very good. Let's move on to our next question. So our next question is going to come from Alex Plant. Alex, you asked a couple of questions, but if you don't mind, I'd like you to ask your question and pick up really where Paul finished, which is about, you know, the challenges, the very nature of the pandemic, and particularly the social distancing requirements that we will have to live with for quite some time, whether that does kind of fundamentally undermine the nature of our urban areas. So Alex, unmute your mic and pose your question. Alex.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and I suppose it very much follows on from what Paul was talking about. My question was whether there's a sort of shift in working patterns that's been forced on us by the pandemic that will subsist, and whether there's then a diminution in the importance of agglomeration as a factor in framing economic policy in the future, particularly perhaps for high-value clusters, which has always been the received wisdom has always been the importance of agglomeration to underpin those kind of those economic successes, and whether that shifts fundamentally as a result of this.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Alex. Paul Swinney, let's go to you. So just make the arguments there that you've kind of alluded to in your first presentation. There were a couple of other questions that are in this sort of vein, particularly about, you know, calling into question whether a city-oriented, particularly a dense city centre oriented kind of development is actually no longer feasible or less feasible, less viable than it was. And then another issue about if we think cities are going to continue, will we see that the nature of the jobs that actually take place in those cities begin to further differentiate between place and across the space? So, Paul.
Yeah, all great and very relevant questions. I think that this is about how cities adapt to the current circumstances and how they might have to operate slightly differently in the future. But that's more about a sort of managerial or management of the city, or a technical issue about how do you try and get people as safely as possible into a very dense area in the city centre, rather than necessarily seeing then just a spread of jobs out. I think the reason for that is, again, for the reasons we've seen over the last 20, 30 years, is that these jobs that are actually more able to be done remotely and more able to be done from home are actually the ones that are increasingly clustered within dense urban cores because of the benefits that we get from face-to-face interaction. And again, I think there'll be elements of no doubt everybody's job being on this call currently that will be more difficult to do because you haven't got that face-to-face interaction, so the subtle bits of information you pick up on by being close to other people. And indeed we are social animals as well and benefit from that. I think what it does mean, however, is that we might see some degree of greater separation in terms of activity, and that actually there's an even greater premium put on, say, face-to-face interaction. And so those elements are increasingly clustered within the centre. Some stuff starts to float away, where face-to-face interaction is a good thing, but it's not sort of vital. But the other elements where actually it's ever more important to have that greater premium put on that, and those jobs increasingly clustering in those cities that are able to provide the types of things that those jobs are looking for, especially high-skilled workers, but also access to other high-skilled companies too. So the challenge there for cities, well, what does that then mean from a transport perspective if you can't get as many people on a tube carriage or a metro link carriage? And I think that then means being creative, say, about walking to some extent, although certainly I don't think people are going to walk 10 miles to work every day. Cycling, definitely. We may see in places where public transport usage is currently high, maybe a switch over to greater cycling. And so what does that mean in terms of infrastructure we put in from a cycling perspective? Paris was already doing this sort of stuff before the crisis hit. Milan is currently putting in a number of new cycleways, which I believe are in response to the crisis. But also raises questions, say, about the legality of e-scooters, for example, which you're not meant to have on pavements or on roads. Currently in the UK, will that be lifted? And will we allow people to commute in by e-scooters? Will electric bikes become more popular as well? So it's these sorts of things about how a city is going to adapt to make sure they continue to offer the key fundamental benefit that they've offered, not just for the last 10 years, but actually for millennia, which is face-to-face interaction.
Excellent. Okay, very good. Because I think there was, again, several questions that have been posed around, how do we safeguard some of the upsides that we've seen in relation to the lockdown? Obviously people are focused about air quality and how air quality in many of our cities have substantively improved as a result of that. So it's a kind of interesting ongoing conversation about how you tweak policy to get some of what you ideally want while safeguarding some of the benefits that we might have seen in different spaces as well. Okay, I want to come back to Elena and Kathrin, and there's been a couple of questions in relation to education, the bits that you were talking about there towards the end of your presentation, Elena. And if I can ask Deirdre, if you can get ready to ask your question. Deirdre's question was a little bit about career service, investment in education and young people, and more generally. And I'll come to you once Deirdre's posted a question. So Deirdre, over to you.
Great. My question was very much around career support services for young people in cities. I recently completed a research project looking at Derby and developing a 5-year strategy. The findings there in that one city showed that there was significant inequity in access to career support services for young people and parents. And I'm quite interested, really. I suppose my concern is that there will be a lot of discussion about further education colleges who've been hit hard by austerity, and concern about the students in higher education. But actually the level 2 provision for young people coming through our education system is something of a concern. And I just was wondering about, where do you see perhaps options at a city level around addressing what could be mass youth unemployment?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Deirdre. And a fantastic question. Ella, you've been doing lots of thinking and work on this before the lockdown and obviously through it. So give us your reflections on that.
Yeah, that's absolutely a great question. And I think especially the point about level 2 provision not being given enough attention, it's something that we've been trying to argue for more attention even before the crisis, and should be a flagship for national government and for local authorities to work on. Obviously, as you said, the access to career services is not the same. There's a lot of inequalities even within the same place. One thing that we argue was that that was pre-crisis, but I think it will be even more important now, is the ability of local authorities to actually bring the key stakeholders together to communicate their messages in terms of education opportunities available, in terms of what businesses need at the local level, and how to join the dots between the two things. And if done at the local level, that would be helpful in terms of reaching out to those disadvantaged communities that wouldn't normally get the support they need, maybe, or they wouldn't know about the support that is available for them. Then on your other point about youth unemployment and what could happen with it, we're really concerned about it as well. There's a lot of work going on. Unfortunately, most of the evidence is at the national level and what different national governments can do to support and reduce youth unemployment. One of the things that have been found to work is one-to-one support and coaching, and having this tailored approach and targeted approach to all the different individual cases. And again, I think there is quite a lot of scope for local areas to be the one delivering this type of service.
Excellent. Great question. And something that we have been and will continue to do an awful lot of work on, in the sense that if we have to help places and people adjust to whatever the next economy or the next version of the economy is going to be, whatever it is, investment in education and training and skills becomes even more important than it was, and it was certainly important enough before the lockdown period. Excellent. I want to turn to get a question from Neil Eccles. Neil from the Rochdale Development Agency. Paul, I might start with you on this one and then draw in Kathrin. He's got a question about how temporary policies become permanent and how we need to think about those kind of things. I will resist making the quip about income tax because everybody does it. However, Neil, unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, hi everyone. I won't talk about income tax.
Good lad.
But my understanding is that history suggests that once policies are enacted, they're quite hard to roll back. And I'm interested to hear what the panel sort of thinks about how easy it is for government to rewind these policies and what impact that might have on cities, such as how do we rewind 100% rate relief on hospitality, and so how does that fit in with social distancing as well?
Excellent question. Very good. Paul, your thoughts on that?
Indeed, I think this is something that that government officials themselves are thinking about at the moment. That obviously a lot of the measures that are being brought into place are being brought in quite rightly, very quickly to deal with the crisis. But we still need to probably backpedal a little bit in terms of how we try and deal with those and wrap them up. You're exactly right. I think in terms of it being very difficult to do and what history suggests around this. I wonder if instead it presents a little bit of an opportunity, in that we know that business rate system doesn't work quite as well as what we would like. Does that then mean that we're now in a position where we might be able to do something a little bit different around local taxes? And that isn't just around taxes on businesses, but actually could we do something a little bit more radical around council tax and stamp duty as well as business rates, to make local taxes more effective, perhaps devolve some of that, allow cities to sort of raise and keep more of the taxes themselves, which sort of sharpens incentives for development and those sorts of things that we do see elsewhere in the world in terms of greater tax devolution. So these are questions that I think are very live at the moment, and some things that we're thinking about. So it's not necessarily the problem of trying to wrap it up, but actually can we turn that into a bit of opportunity and perhaps sort of change the system if we feel the system is actually not been working particularly well in the last 10 or 20 years.
And it's a genuine question up for grabs at the minute, Paul, colleagues, around the appetite for fairly substantive reform in certain areas, and whether there will be an appetite for substantive reform even as we come out of the lockdown period, or actually now is not the time to be fundamentally reforming systems. We have to work with the grain, and I think that's an open question that applies to things like business rates. It applies to bigger questions about local government finance, local government reform, and a whole manner of other areas. It'll be interesting to see whether the government signals its appetite for extensive reforms or not. Paul, your thought on that?
Yeah, I think we wait to see on those sorts of things. No doubt, both national and local government is very consumed by, quite rightly, by everything that's going on at the moment, and we'll see sort of how radical they want to be. I think it is quite interesting. You've got the aftermath, hopefully, which will be pretty quick or pretty soon in terms of the crisis, plus Brexit coming in, sort of leading to very big, quite structural change in the economy, plus an agenda which is about trying to level up the economy. Do those three things coming together mean that actually the government's got more appetite to try something different? And so what does that mean for business rates? What does that mean for property ownership on the high street? What does that mean for transport, for example, and transport for London-style bodies elsewhere? Are we now in a position, because we have nationalised quite effectively quite a lot of rail and buses, that we can now do something different in terms of how we provide transport in cities further north too? So we wait to see, I think, the appetite for that. Clearly, as you say, Andrew, now is not the time today to be trying to bring about that sort of reform. But the door has been open to perhaps think about things in a slightly different way, in a way that we might not have been able to in the past. And so the question is, what opportunities does that then provide? And are politicians able to grasp that? Okay,
very good. I'm conscious I'm jumping around between different issues and going backwards and forwards. I'm even less strategic than I usually am when we're organising these kind of events. I'm just trying to pick up lots of the good questions that have come forward. We will come on to in a minute. We've had several questions on whether past experiences, particularly the 08 recession, can tell us anything about the current situation. So put my colleagues on alert in relation to that. But before we do that, I want to get a point from David Renard from Swindon. He asks this question, it'll be to you, Kathrin, around the degree to which we know anything about the specific industries in places and whether they have large effects. I guess it's partly about what the industries, does that matter? Or are we worried about just big employers that if they get into trouble, by very nature, they have a kind of large localized effect? But David Renard, unmute and ask your question. David.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Andrew. My observation of the data that you presented earlier on was that those places like Crawley and Luton, who are highly dependent on airports for employment and for income, are disproportionately affected. So the Swindon economy is very dependent on Heathrow, but we don't get any income from Heathrow, and we don't supply a huge amount of employment to it either. So my question was, are there any other factors that have a disproportionate effect on the data that you showed us earlier on?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. Obviously touches on your position in Swindon with having several quite large employers, obviously, and some have got have got into difficulties in the previous times and have had kind of local effects that you've had to deal with. So Kathrin, can you just say something a little bit more around industry size, other activities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So what we did when our study was basically looking at industries and how the jobs in these industries are distributed across cities. So there may be industries dependent on the airport too in Swindon, but it may not have been pictured now in our analysis because we have just like an immediate effect analysis at this point. We are now working on more supply chain analysis where we also would look at the spillovers for other industries and other places. But at this point, yeah, we definitely have just certain industries in mind, and they have not particularly been exposed in Swindon.
Excellent. Okay. So, as I said, we've had several questions from on learning from the past. So, Daniel Timms, if you're still on the call, Daniel, unmute your mic and ask your question in relation to learning from the past. Daniel? There he is. Good.
Will do, thanks. Yeah, it was simply that. Can we learn from both the immediate effects of the last major economic shock and maybe what happened a bit over the following years to get a sense of what might happen with this current economic shock? Or do you think the fact that the nature and cause of this is very different means that it doesn't have much to tell us about what's going to happen?
Yeah, and I suppose as always, there's two aspects. Can we learn from the past about how it played out in the short run? And obviously, can we learn anything from actually how it then played out over the kind of medium term and how policy responded to that? Paul, why didn't you have a bash at that?
Yeah, a lot of people, a lot of commentators have been making the comparison, certainly to the last recession. I think I'll be cautious about trying to draw comparisons with certainly the last recession, but recessions before that too. And that the nature of what's going on here is that, parts of the economy have literally ground to a halt. We have closed down lots of retail, majority of restaurants, cafes closed, etc., etc. And this isn't really anything like we've had before. So how we then expect, I think, this sort of downturn to play out, there isn't a great deal to learn from, say, 2009, where that is much more about I was going to say gradual slowdown relative to the seizing of the economy anyway. It's a case of, it's not literally businesses have closed or large numbers of businesses have closed overnight. It's that actually businesses are doing less activity in certain parts of the economy, or that's what happened in 2009. So I think the short-term element, have to be careful about that. The longer term element, I think, if it depends how long this goes on for. If we're talking about a very short and sharp dip where literally the economy sort of was frozen in time, and then we sort of released it and it got going again, say over a 6-week or an 8-week period, then you would expect things to bounce back fairly quickly, and there wouldn't be much to learn from elsewhere. But if this goes on terms for a little bit longer, businesses start to close, unemployment then rises and stays higher. I think there's particular issues there in terms of how long unemployment takes to reduce, but particularly the elements around, going back to the earlier question about youth unemployment and the scarring impact of young people being out of work for a long time. And I think it's that element there that we would then start to learn from previous recessions about, well, what have we done from a policy perspective? How did that try and deal with the problem or not, as the case may be? And how does that alter our approach now? But like I said, that very much depends on the nature of how long is this going to go on for. Are we talking about a short, sharp dip and a bounce back? Or are we talking about something that's going to last months into years?
Excellent. Eleanor, give us a thought on this perspective. And you do a lot of work on the interface between education, skills, labour market participation. Is there anything to learn from previous recessions or previous economic shocks in how we deal with some of those that are adversely affected through the education system?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Paul said so far, and I think the feeling is that the places that were in a weaker position before the crisis, especially in terms of the skills level, in terms of their employment outlook, might be the ones that we see on the other side also being in a weaker position, because they were in a weaker position to respond to the crisis in itself. As Paul said, there are opportunities to learn in terms of the policy response to the previous crisis. So if we think about youth unemployment, for example, and the financial crisis, there were programs that were put in place, like the Future Jobs Fund for young people, and we know that had a positive impact in terms of people, opportunity to be in work. So there are things that we could learn, and I think especially in terms of the policy response of what helps, for example, prevent the scarring effect for young people.
Okay, very good. Yeah, sorry. We've got time for one more question, and I'm going to get, because it's sort of similar vein, and it's a challenge, I suppose, partly to both of the analysis, but also the policy. And it's about whether, this is about doing more quickly what we were probably wanting to do anyway, or does it actually suggest that we need to, think quite radically and differently about things? And that's Jonathan Nunn. Jonathan, are you still on the call?
Yes, I am.
If you are, can you just ask your question? It would be a fantastic way to finish. Jonathan.
Okay, great. So the data presented principally by Eleanor and Kathrin really suggests that simply there's a need to do much more, much quicker than might have been the case, particularly for those local authorities that were already committed to place-based working with an inclusive economy agenda. So is there anything in the data that jumps out that breaks that mold, suggests the need to rethink or adjust approaches?
Excellent, great question. So I'm going to give our three contributors a bash at this each in the order. Well, let's go to you, Eleanor, first, and then to Kathrin, and I'll give the final word to Paul. Eleanor.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two elements to it. There's a short-term element and a long-term element. In the short term, trying to have a completely radical system would would risk to end up actually doing more harm to the people that you're trying to support, because you would have to rethink the entire system in a very short amount of time, and that might not be feasible. So in the short term, trying to tweak what your policy mechanisms are might be the best solution to try to minimize the effect of the crisis. But in the longer term, yes, absolutely, all of this points to much more commitment to the Leveling Up agenda and trying to reduce inequalities across the country.
Excellent. Okay, very good. Over to you, Kathrin. You've been doing work on sort of business support, innovation, in that sort of space. More, different, quicker. What's your reflection on that? Jonathan's question.
Yeah, I think a point we haven't discussed yet is also really how to get the workers back to the labor market, and it would be definitely the current system with the job retention scheme, which is nice, still to adopt, because if a lot of jobs are still furloughed and people cannot actually access any work, the scars of unemployment will appear much more often. So I think one thing to think of is using the existing structures, but giving people better access to the labor market, maybe with rather short-term work, etc. But in the long run, looking at the specific potential of each place to work on and to develop new strategies, for the future.
Excellent. Okay, Paul.
Mute myself, apologies. We're currently in the stage of propping up the economy rather than levelling up the economy. The Chancellor's put in a number of initiatives that I think we need to see probably play out in their effectiveness before doing anything different. So I wouldn't propose tweaking what's being done in the short term unless data starts to come out and suggest that it's not having the impact that it's having. There's then a question, as we had earlier, about how you try and unpick all of that. Questions, we'll certainly try and figure all that out, I think, as a policy community. But then in terms of the longer term response, the government's made a commitment to levelling up the economy, but we've been trying to do that for at least 85 years now. And a lot of the policies that have been put in place have not been working. So that longer term view about trying to make principally big cities in the north more attractive places to come and do business, that's where the focus needs to be on. But our approach to that is probably going to have to be different in the next 5 to 10 years, as opposed to the last 85 years in terms of policies that we've done.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed to Paul and to my colleagues. That concludes the event. Thank you all for joining. More details on the research that we've been talking about and sharing today is available on our website, along with everything else. Please have a look and come back to us with queries. Our next online event is going to be next Thursday, May the 7th, when we should have been having the local elections and the Metro Mayor elections. And aptly on that day, we'll be talking about the future of devolution, how that plays out, how that fits into the Levelling Up agenda and the post-lockdown period. So thank you very much for joining. If you can help us make our events much better, there's an online survey which is on the, you can see through the chat function. Please take a moment, fill it in, send it back. We really do value your feedback. But for now, thanks for joining in. Stay safe and go well. Thank you very much indeed.